The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning, just 6 months after Emily Ashford's wedding. Emily glanced at the unfamiliar number flashing across her phone while she finished updating a patient's chart at St. Mary's Medical Center. She almost let it go to voicemail. Most unknown calls during her shift were insurance companies or telemarketers. Something made her answer anyway. "This is Emily. Mrs. Ashford?" The voice was formal, measured. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I'm an attorney with Whitmore, Lawson & Pierce." Emily frowned. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number." "I assure you, I don't." She closed the patient chart and stepped into the quiet hallway outside the pediatric ward. "What can I do for you, Mr. Whitmore?" "I represent Carter Construction Incorporated." Emily's footsteps stopped. She hadn't heard those two words together in months. Carter Construction, her father's company, or rather, the company she'd spent years pretending no longer existed. "I'm not involved with Carter Construction, I know." Another pause. "The board has asked me to contact you anyway." Emily looked through the large hospital windows as rain slid down the glass. "I'm afraid I can't help you. I think you should hear why they're asking." She leaned against the wall. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh coffee. Nurses walked past carrying medication trays, completely unaware that one phone call was quietly pulling Emily back toward the family she'd finally learned to live without. "I'm listening." Mr. Whitmore took a slow breath. "Carter Construction has entered financial distress." Emily said nothing. "The company has missed payroll twice." Still nothing. "The bank has frozen its operating accounts." Her expression didn't change. "There are currently 14 lawsuits pending." Silence. Then, "Your parents have requested a meeting." Emily closed her eyes. "They have my number. They asked us to call instead." She almost laughed. Not because anything was amusing, but because even now, even when everything was falling apart, they still couldn't bring themselves to ask for her help themselves. "What exactly do they want?" "They're hoping you'll speak with your husband." Emily looked down at the simple gold wedding band resting beside her engagement ring. "My husband, Michael Ashford." The attorney hesitated. "They believe Ashford Capital may be willing to invest." Emily's shoulders slowly fell. So that was it. Not an apology, not reconciliation, not regret. Business. Only business. "They know Michael doesn't make those decisions alone. They do. And they still think I'd ask him." "Yes." Emily looked through the pediatric ward window. Inside, a little boy was laughing while one of the nurses helped him decorate a paper dinosaur with stickers. Life had a strange way of keeping perspective. One room held childhood joy. Another held the weight of a family that had spent decades choosing pride over love. Finally, Emily spoke. "I'll come." The attorney sounded surprised. "You will?" "I'll hear what they have to say." He exhaled with obvious relief. "The meeting is tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. "Where?" "Our offices." Emily reached for the door handle leading back into the pediatric unit. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes, Mrs. Ashford?" "Please let my parents know I'm coming, because I want to understand what happened." She paused. "Not because I've forgotten what they did." When the call ended, Emily slipped her phone back into her pocket and returned to room 214. 7-year-old Liam Patterson looked up from his hospital bed. "Miss Emily." She smiled. "Yes? Are you okay?" Emily walked over and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, the way someone does something familiar. "I will be." Liam studied her face for a moment before nodding. "My grandma says grown-ups get sad too." Emily smiled a little wider. "Your grandma sounds very wise." He handed her a dinosaur sticker. "You can have this one." Emily accepted it as though it were something priceless. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness arrived exactly when they were needed. She had no idea that less than 24 hours later, she would sit across from the same family who once told her not to come home. Only this time, they needed her more than she had ever needed them. The following morning arrived gray and cold. A steady drizzle coated downtown Charleston as Emily parked outside the 12-story office building that housed Whitmore, Lawson, and Pierce. She remained in the driver's seat for almost a minute, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to walk into that building without carrying yesterday's hurt. Some wounds deserved to stay in the past. Others insisted on following you through the front door. She stepped out, buttoned her navy wool coat, and crossed the polished marble lobby. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford," the receptionist said politely. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting you." Emily offered a small smile. Thank you. The elevator ride to the ninth floor was silent, except for the soft, instrumental music playing through hidden speakers. When the doors opened, Charles Whitmore was already waiting. He extended his hand. Mrs. Ashford. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate you coming. Emily glanced toward the large conference room behind him. They're already here, aren't they? He nodded once. They arrived nearly an hour early. Something in the room shifted before she even walked inside. Not because anyone had spoken, but because everyone was waiting for the same moment. Charles gently pushed open the heavy walnut door. Emily recognized them immediately. Richard Carter looked older than she remembered. His dark hair had turned almost completely gray. The confident posture she associated with her father had disappeared. Patricia Carter sat beside him, twisting her wedding ring over and over again. Daniel occupied the chair nearest the windows. His expensive suit looked as though it had been tailored only weeks before, yet the dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he hadn't slept in days. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody smiled, nobody knew how to begin. It was Patricia who finally stood. Emily. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from her, gentle, almost careful. Emily answered with a polite nod. Mom. Richard cleared his throat. Thank you for coming. I almost didn't. No one argued. Charles Whitmore quietly closed the conference room door before taking a seat near the far end of the table. A thick stack of financial binders rested in front of him. Emily noticed them immediately. Years of reading patient charts had taught her to pay attention to paperwork before people. Documents rarely lied. Richard folded his hands together. I know we don't deserve your time. Emily remained standing. What do you need? The question landed heavily, not because it was rude, but because everyone understood it should never have been necessary. Daniel leaned forward first. We need Ashford Capital. Emily looked at him. No. He frowned. You haven't even heard the proposal. I heard enough yesterday. This isn't about pride. Emily met his eyes without raising her voice. Then why wasn't it about family 6 months ago? Daniel looked away first. Charles Whitmore opened the first binder. Perhaps it would help if Mrs. Ashford understood the current position. Emily finally took a seat. The attorney slid several documents across the polished table. Profit and loss statements, payroll reports, bank notices, tax filings, construction contracts. The numbers blurred together at first. Then, one figure caught her attention. She looked up. You've lost nearly $18 million. Charles nodded. Over the past 28 months. Emily slowly turned another page, then another. Her brow tightened. This doesn't make sense. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. What doesn't? She tapped one of the reports. Carter Construction was profitable. It was. You had signed contracts with the Port of Charleston, the county school district, and 3 commercial developers. Yes. So how does a company with this much incoming revenue end up unable to meet payroll? Silence. Emily flipped another page, then another. Her eyes stopped on a series of wire transfers. She read each one twice. Her expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for Charles Whitmore to notice. You found something. Emily pointed to the ledger. These transfers. Daniel immediately answered. Operating expenses. She didn't look at him. No. They are. She calmly slid the page across the table. No legitimate operating expense is wired every month to 4 different companies that all use the same registered mailing address. Daniel's face drained of color. Emily looked toward Charles. Did your auditors verify these businesses? We're still investigating. She reached for another binder. The body kept careful records, so did accounting ledgers. Someone had spent years trying to hide these transactions. Someone who believed no one would ever bother reading every page. Emily had learned to notice details other people skipped. A misplaced decimal on a medication chart, a missing allergy note, a date that didn't belong. Now those same instincts were telling her something far more troubling. This company didn't fail overnight. She looked around the room. It has been bleeding money for years, nobody answered. Not because they disagreed, but because someone at that table already knew she was right. Emily stared at the certificate for several long seconds. The paper had yellowed with age. The Carter Construction seal was embossed across the top in faded blue ink. Beneath it, in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, was a note. For Emily Grace Carter, whose kindness has always been her greatest strength. Her fingers stopped moving. She remembered that handwriting. The careful loops, the perfectly straight lines. Her grandfather had insisted that every signature reflected the person behind it. "If you're rushed when you sign your name," he used to tell her, "you're probably rushing through something that deserves your full attention." Emily looked up. "What is this?" No one answered. She asked again, "What is this?" Charles Whitmore adjusted his glasses. When Harold Carter passed away in April of 2016, he left 40% of Carter Construction to Richard Carter. He turned another page. 30% to Daniel Carter. Emily nodded slowly. And the remaining 30%, he gently pushed the certificate toward her, was left to you. Silence. Complete silence. Emily frowned. "That's impossible." "It isn't. I never inherited anything." Charles folded his hands. "According to these records," he opened another folder. "You did." Emily looked across the table. Her father still couldn't meet her eyes. Her mother had begun crying quietly. Daniel sat perfectly still. She suddenly understood, not the details, but the betrayal. "You knew." No one answered. She looked at her father. "You knew." Richard finally lifted his head. "We were trying to protect the company." Emily almost laughed, not because anything was amusing, but because she had heard those exact words before. Every unfair decision in her childhood had somehow been for the good of the family. Every sacrifice had been expected from her, never from Daniel. "What happened to my shares?" Richard rubbed both hands across his face. "The board." Emily interrupted him. "No." Her voice remained calm. "I didn't ask what the board did." She held his gaze. "I asked what you did." The room became so quiet that the rain tapping against the office windows sounded impossibly loud. Finally, Richard answered. 3 months after your grandfather's funeral," he swallowed. "I asked you to sign several estate documents." Emily searched her memory. She remembered. She had signed papers in the family dining room. Her father had told her they were routine probate forms. She had barely looked at them. She trusted him. Charles slowly slid another document across the table. It wasn't a probate document. Emily looked down. The heading read, "Transfer of Share Ownership." Her signature appeared at the bottom. Her heart sank. "I don't remember this." Charles nodded sympathetically. The document was folded beneath the others. Emily looked back at her father. "You told me they were insurance forms." Richard closed his eyes. "I know. You lied." "I did. You let me sign away nearly a third of Grandpa's company." Her voice cracked for the first time. "Without telling me what I was signing." Patricia suddenly spoke through tears. "We thought it was the right thing." Emily turned toward her mother. "For who?" Patricia couldn't answer. Daniel finally leaned forward. "You weren't interested in construction." Emily looked at him. "I didn't have to be. You never wanted the business." "I was never given the chance to decide." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. She was right. He knew it. Everyone did. Charles reached into the folder one final time. "There is something else." Emily almost smiled. She wasn't sure how there could possibly be more. The attorney placed a small digital recorder on the conference table. Old, silver, no larger than a deck of cards. Richard's face immediately lost what little color remained. "What is that?" Charles answered quietly. "We found it in Harold Carter's estate box at First National Bank." Emily frowned. "My grandfather had a safe deposit box?" "He did. No one told me." Charles looked toward Richard before returning his attention to Emily. "It remained sealed until last month." He pressed one button. Static filled the room. Then, an elderly man's voice. Clear despite the years. "Harold Carter, if you're listening to this." Emily's eyes widened. "Then something has gone terribly wrong." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Daniel's hands stopped fidgeting beneath the table. Harold continued. "Richard." There was a long pause. "If you've honored my wishes..." Another pause. "Emily already knows she's an owner." Emily slowly looked at her father. He stared at the recorder as though seeing a ghost. "But if she doesn't," Harold's voice grew softer, "then you've broken your promise to me." Patricia began sobbing openly. Richard covered his face with both hands. Emily remained perfectly still, not because she wasn't hurting, but because the truth had finally found its own voice, and it belonged to the one man who had believed in her all along. The recording continued. Harold Carter's breathing was slower than Emily remembered. Age had softened his once commanding voice, but not his conviction. "Emily," he said gently, "if you're hearing this, then I wasn't here to protect you when you needed it most." Emily felt the back of her throat tighten. She hadn't heard her grandfather's voice in almost 10 years. It was measured in heartbeats. The room disappeared. For just a moment, she was 21 again, sitting beside him in the workshop behind the old family house while he patiently explained how to repair an antique clock. "Every machine tells the truth," he used to say. "You just have to listen long enough." His voice filled the conference room once more. "When your grandmother died, I promised myself that neither of my grandchildren would ever have to compete for my love." He paused to catch his breath. "Daniel has always been ambitious." Another pause. "Emily has always been compassionate. They're different. Not better, not worse. Different." Richard lowered his head even further. Harold continued. "I divided this company the way I did because businesses need ambition, but families need kindness." Emily closed her eyes. A single tear escaped before she quietly brushed it away. "The world will reward Daniel for being strong. I wanted the family to reward Emily for being good." No one spoke, not even Charles Whitmore. "If Richard tells you the company belongs only to your brother," Harold sighed, "he's wrong. If anyone asks you to surrender what I've left you," another pause, "don't. I didn't leave you shares because you needed money. I left them because one day this family might need your judgment." The recorder clicked softly. The message ended. No one moved. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Finally, Richard Carter spoke, barely above a whisper. "I failed him." Emily looked at her father. He seemed smaller than she had ever seen him. Not because he had aged, but because truth had a way of shrinking pride. "I thought I was protecting everything he'd built." His voice shook. "I convinced myself Daniel needed control. I kept telling myself you were happy with your nursing career." Emily answered quietly. "I was." Richard looked confused. "I loved being a nurse." She folded her hands together. "But that was never your decision to make." He nodded slowly. "No, it wasn't." Daniel suddenly pushed his chair back. "So what happens now?" Charles Whitmore answered before anyone else could. "Legally," Daniel nodded. "Legally." Charles opened another folder. "If the transfer of Mrs. Ashford's shares is found to have been obtained through misrepresentation." He looked directly at Daniel. "The transfer may be declared invalid." Daniel's face hardened. "That was almost 10 years ago." "It was. There's no way a court reopens something that old." Charles remained calm. "Ordinarily, no." He turned another page. "However," everyone waited. South Carolina law tolls the statute of limitations when material facts were intentionally concealed from the injured party. Daniel stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Charles carefully removed his glasses, "the clock does not begin until the deception is discovered." Emily looked down at the stock certificate resting before her. For nearly a decade, she had believed she owned nothing. Now she was learning she had never willingly given anything away. Daniel stood. "This is ridiculous." "No," Charles replied. "It's unfortunate." Daniel began pacing toward the windows. "So what? You expect me to hand over 30% of the company while we're already bankrupt?" "No." Charles' answer surprised everyone. "I expect the court to determine lawful ownership." Richard slowly looked at his son. Daniel, he had not called his son's name that gently in years. "We may have to accept this." Daniel turned sharply. "No, you heard Grandpa. I heard an old recording." "You heard the truth." Daniel laughed bitterly. "The truth?" He pointed toward Emily. She walked away. Emily finally spoke. "I didn't walk away. You left. I was pushed out. You chose your career. I chose to stop begging people to want me." Something in the room shifted. Even Daniel felt it, because for the first time, Emily wasn't defending herself. She was simply describing what had happened. The facts had become impossible to argue with. Charles quietly gathered several folders into one stack. "There is another issue." Emily looked toward him. "What issue?" "The bankruptcy investigation." Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Charles continued. "Our forensic accountants have identified approximately $6 million that remain unaccounted for." Richard frowned. "I thought you said 18 million. 18 million in losses." Charles nodded. 6 million is still missing." The room fell silent again. He placed a new folder on the table. Unlike the others, this one carried a bright red label, "Confidential." Charles rested his hand on top of it. "We received this file less than an hour before today's meeting." Emily noticed something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't addressed to the law firm. It wasn't addressed to the bank. It wasn't addressed to Carter Construction. Across the front, typed neatly in black ink, were 5 words. To be opened by Emily Ashford. She looked up. Who sent it? Charles answered quietly. We don't know. And according to the courier, he slowly slid the sealed envelope across the polished table. Whoever delivered it said it would explain where the missing $6 million went. Emily reached toward the envelope, then stopped. Sometimes the truth didn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it came one sealed envelope at a time. No one reached for the envelope. It rested in the center of the conference table like something fragile or dangerous. The rain continued tapping softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charles Whitmore broke the silence. It was delivered by courier at 8:15 this morning. Emily kept her eyes on the envelope. No return address? None. Signature? The courier said. The sender insisted on remaining anonymous. Daniel scoffed. This is ridiculous. Charles didn't respond. Instead, he slid the envelope toward Emily. It's addressed to you. Emily looked around the room. Her father seemed exhausted. Her mother hadn't stopped crying. Daniel had crossed his arms, trying to appear unaffected, but his right foot wouldn't stop tapping against the floor. The body kept careful records. Fear often began in the smallest movements. Emily carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single flash drive. Nothing else. No letter, no explanation. Just a silver flash drive with a small, handwritten label. Play this first. Charles looked toward the conference room television mounted on the wall. If everyone agrees, Emily nodded. He connected the drive to his laptop. A single video file appeared. No title, no date. Charles pressed play. For several seconds, the screen remained black. Then security camera footage appeared. A timestamp in the lower right corner read, April 18, 2024, 9:47 p.m. Emily recognized the room immediately, the executive conference room inside Carter Construction. The lights were off except for one lamp near the windows. Daniel walked into view, carrying a leather briefcase. A second man entered behind him. Charles paused the video. Do you recognize him? Richard leaned closer. That's Stephen Brooks, our chief financial officer. Charles nodded. The video continued. Stephen placed several folders on the conference table. Daniel opened one. Although the camera couldn't capture their conversation, it clearly showed Stephen pointing to one document after another. Daniel hesitated, then signed every page. Stephen smiled. The two men shook hands. Daniel gathered the papers. Before leaving, Stephen quietly removed one folder from the briefcase and slipped it into his own jacket. Emily frowned. Pause it. Charles stopped the video. What did you see? Emily pointed toward the screen. The folder. What about it? When Daniel arrived, there were 4 folders. Charles counted silently. There were. When they left, Emily looked directly at him. There were only 3. Richard stood. I don't understand. Emily rewound the footage herself. Watch Stephen's left hand. The video played again. This time, everyone saw it. The movement was quick, practiced. Stephen removed the 4th folder while Daniel was signing the last document. Daniel never looked up. Charles slowly leaned back in his chair. I missed that. Emily nodded. He wanted you to. Daniel stared at the frozen image. I never saw him take it. I believe you. Everyone turned toward Emily. Even Daniel. You believe me? She nodded once. Yes. Charles looked surprised. Emily folded her hands. Because this wasn't the behavior of 2 partners stealing together. She pointed toward the screen. This was the behavior of one man taking advantage of another who trusted him. Daniel didn't speak. His shoulders slowly dropped. For the first time since the meeting began, the anger left his face. It was replaced by something much heavier. Shame. I signed everything. His voice was barely audible. I never read half of it. Richard looked at his son. You always said there wasn't time. Daniel nodded slowly. There wasn't. There should have been. Emily said nothing. She remembered countless evenings when Daniel had laughed at her for spending extra time reviewing medication charts. You read too much, he used to joke. One missed detail can cost a life, she'd always answered. Apparently, the same was true in business. Charles resumed the recording. The next clip showed Stephen Brooks entering the accounting office alone nearly an hour later. He unlocked a filing cabinet, removed several binders, photographed dozens of pages, then quietly replaced them. Finally, he inserted a small USB drive into the office computer. Emily leaned forward. What did he copy? We don't know yet. Charles clicked another file. This one showed Stephen leaving the building carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes. The timestamp read 11:32 p.m. Richard frowned. He told us those records were being moved to storage. Charles looked toward him. They weren't. Silence settled over the room again. Then Emily noticed something no one else had. Go back. Charles rewound the footage. There. She pointed toward the edge of the screen. A reflection, barely visible in the conference room window. Someone else had been standing outside the room, watching. Charles enlarged the image. The resolution became grainy. The figure wasn't clear, but one detail stood out. The person wore a distinctive silver cane with a carved eagle's head. Richard's eyes widened. I know that cane. Patricia looked up. So do I. Daniel frowned. Who? Richard answered slowly. Thomas Bennett. Charles looked confused. The former chairman of our board. Richard nodded. He retired 3 years ago. Emily looked at her father. Did he ever trust Stephen Brooks? Richard laughed bitterly. No. He wanted him fired. What happened? I overruled him. Charles closed the laptop. I think it's time we spoke to Mr. Bennett. Emily looked down at the flash drive, still resting beside her. Someone had risked everything to send it. Someone who wanted the truth uncovered. But as Charles reached back into the envelope, his expression changed. There was one more thing. He unfolded a small handwritten note that had been tucked beneath the flash drive. Only one sentence had been written across the page. In neat block letters. Stephen Brooks didn't act alone. Follow the signatures from October 2021. Something in the room shifted. Emily looked at the financial binders stacked beside Charles. October 2021. She remembered seeing that date before, not on a bank statement, not on a payroll report, but on another document. A document that had seemed ordinary, until now. Emily didn't say anything. She reached for the nearest binder and flipped carefully through the quarterly reports. October 2021. The date lingered in her mind. Not because it sounded familiar, but because she remembered seeing it less than an hour earlier. The board resolutions, she said quietly. Charles looked up. What? The board resolutions from October 2021. He immediately began searching through the stack beside him. Within moments, he found a navy blue folder stamped BR of Directors Special Meeting. October 14th, 2021. Charles opened it. There are 4 resolutions. Emily extended her hand. May I? He passed her the folder. She read each page slowly. The way someone checks a medication dosage one final time before handing it to a patient. No assumptions, no shortcuts. Page 1 authorized a construction loan. Nothing unusual. Page 2 approved new equipment purchases. Again, normal. Page 3 approved refinancing several company assets. Still reasonable. Then she reached page 4. Her eyes stopped. Here. Charles leaned closer. What did you find? Emily slid the document across the polished table. Look at the signatures. Richard frowned. They're ours. Emily nodded. 3 of them are. Daniel looked confused. What do you mean 3? There should be 4. There are. No. She pointed carefully. These 3 signatures were written with blue ink. Everyone leaned in. The 4th one, she paused, is black. Charles adjusted his glasses. So? Emily looked toward him. When several people sign the same document during one meeting, she tapped the page. They almost always use the same pen. Silence. Especially when the corporate secretary passes one around the table. Richard slowly nodded. That's exactly how we did it, Emily continued. This signature wasn't signed during the meeting. Daniel frowned. You can tell all that from the ink? No? She looked closer. I can tell from the pressure. Charles blinked. The pressure? Emily smiled faintly. My grandfather taught me calligraphy when I was little. She ran one finger just above the signature without touching it. When someone signs naturally, she traced the movement in the air. Their hand speeds up through familiar letters. She pointed toward Richard's signature. This one flows, then Patricia's. So does this, then Daniel's, even this one. Finally, she reached the 4th signature, but this, she looked at Charles, was copied. The room became perfectly still. Richard leaned so close his glasses nearly touched the page. My God. Charles immediately removed another document from the folder, the attendance sheet. He placed it beside the resolution. The signatures appeared nearly identical, almost. Emily noticed it immediately. There. Charles followed her finger, the capital T. On the attendance sheet, it curved naturally. On the resolution, the crossbar had been drawn separately, as though someone had paused, then finished it. Thomas Bennett. Richard whispered the name. He never signed this. Charles slowly sat back. If that's true, the resolution isn't valid. Emily nodded. Neither are the refinancing approvals attached to it. Daniel stared at the papers. What does that mean? Charles answered carefully. It means the loans your company received may have been obtained using unauthorized corporate approvals. Richard's face lost what little color remained. The bank, Charles nodded, believed the board unanimously approved the transaction. They didn't. No. Silence. The kind that changed everything. Daniel looked toward Emily. For years, his voice cracked. I thought you hated me. Emily met his eyes. I didn't. You stopped coming home. I stopped begging to be invited. He looked away. I thought you blamed me. I blamed all of you. She didn't say it with anger, only honesty. I blamed every person who watched me disappear from this family. She looked toward her parents. And decided silence was easier. Patricia broke down completely. I'm so sorry. Emily didn't answer. Not because she rejected the apology, but because apologies and accountability were not the same thing. Charles suddenly received a notification on his laptop. A soft chime interrupted the silence. He frowned. What is it? Richard asked. Charles stared at the screen. His expression changed. I don't believe this. Emily looked toward him. What happened? I've just received an email from the forensic accounting team. He clicked it open. Attached was a scanned document, a wire transfer authorization, dated October 15, 2021. The morning after the forged board meeting. Charles enlarged the image, every eye in the room fixed on the signature at the bottom. Daniel shook his head. I didn't sign that. Charles zoomed in further. No. He looked toward Emily. You were right. Again. Richard frowned. What now? Charles slowly turned the laptop toward everyone. The signature belongs to Thomas Bennett, but according to every corporate record, he looked around the table. Thomas Bennett was in Boston, attending his granddaughter's graduation that entire week. Emily felt a chill run through her. Someone hadn't simply hidden money. Someone had forged board approvals, forged executive signatures, and built an entire financial collapse on documents that should never have existed. Then Charles noticed something else. A small notation in the corner of the scanned document, almost too small to read. He enlarged it. The room fell silent. Printed in tiny gray letters were 7 words. Authorized by Executive Committee Chair M. Carter. Emily slowly turned toward her father. Richard stared at the screen as though he had never seen those words before. And for the first time that day, Emily wasn't wondering who had stolen the company. She was wondering whether someone had been using her father's name or whether there was one final truth he still hadn't found the courage to tell.